Good afternoon. Welcome back to Tune It Over. I'm still Jack Chew, and this is our daily on weekdays show to talk about what is topical, what is current. And I can think of nothing better than the fact that the beer gardens are now open. I nearly said the pubs are now open. It's I reckon, a soft launch in many ways, but the weather's been all right. So it has really felt quite liberating for us all to go and get a pint in hand once again. And so I thought it'd be smart for us to get a word from hospitality. And I've got a good friend of mine, Chris Pollard, is going to be joining me to talk a little bit about what they've been going through as a sector, as an industry. I think some of it almost you can feel like intuitively it's going to have been hugely disrupted, decimated in many ways. But some of the finer details that I know Chris will be able to bring to bear will be stuff that we won't necessarily considered in healthcare. We've been obviously under the cosh in various other ways, but also as people, as drinkers, as people that want to interact and socialise, as well as people that recognise the importance of those things to our patients and our community, and even the ability to socialise as teams, as businesses and stuff. We're certainly all ready for Zoom quizzes to be phased out, and for beer gardens and getting together around a pub quiz to be phased back in. And so I'm really pleased to be chatting to my friend Chris about this today. And so hopefully within a couple of clicks, I can bring in Chris Pollard. Chris, can you hear me, mate?
I can hear you.
Nice one. Well, thanks for coming on the show. And what I wanted to jump straight into first is obviously introductions. What is it you do for a living, and why is it that you're therefore qualified to speak to this topic?
Great. I mean, I guess on the most basic level, the best way to describe it is I sell booze. But I suppose it's a much more overarching kind of business than that. But without telling you my entire life story, my background is kind of coming through university, starting working in bars to kind of pay my way through that. Failed to get, any of the super important graduate scheme jobs that, I was sort of trying to get in the public sector, local government and that kind of thing. And in the meantime, kind of fell in love with hospitality and actually realized I actually really enjoy this. So I kind of moved, I guess, up through the drinks world, and then eventually was kind of tapped up by the brands to then move across to kind of sell the booze. So effectively, our business, I work for a company called Mangrove. We employ about 35 people, and I basically run the team who sell the products to the bars, restaurants, pubs, clubs, hotels, golf courses, and everything in between that is considered hospitality.
Right. So selling booze could be kiosk bargain booze, or it could be a slightly more highfalutin version of which you do, which is still selling booze, but certainly a slightly different context, and certainly matters more the relationship that you have with the actual licensed premises is quite different, and therefore gives you that deeper insight that I really wanted to bring out in this conversation. Could you give us a bit of an insight then as to what has happened to hospitality over the last 12, 14 months?
I think you did use the word decimated in the intro. It's probably quite an accurate description. It's been, obviously, of course, this week so far has been unbelievably positive. Still not, I think, there's no doubt that it's still going to be a challenge. Yes, beer gardens are open, the weather's been good, but obviously it's still only, we estimate, about 40% of capacity that people are, in general, able to open up. And obviously, from my point of view as a someone who sells spirits, I'd imagine the first thing people are doing will mainly be drinking pints. So, for us, a lot of our kind of business comes from that kind of late night cocktails, shops at the bar, all that kind of stuff.
Right, okay.
Whereas, beer and wine at the moment probably doing quite well for the first few weeks, but that'll level out. But in terms of, the last year, obviously it's just been a nightmare. It's been a never ending kind of start-stop kind of process. And just when you think there's light at the end of the tunnel, suddenly that tunnel closes in again, which has obviously been hugely frustrating for us as a business. We're turning over, I think, so we work on a kind of financial year basis. So we're about to close our financial year about 50% down on our kind of usual take. That then obviously filters through to the actual venues themselves, will be even more, kind of further down than that in terms of a business sense, which then obviously pushes onto the individuals. And, a lot of people in our industry will quite literally have been on furlough for an entire year at this point. And, you know, I think there's a bit of maybe a stereotype around being on furlough, and I've heard people say like, oh, I don't have the luxury of being on furlough, but, you know, I can promise you that the people that we work with, and, you know, the people on my side who, you know, work with me, it's been really tough, like, to kind of sit at home for an entire year, not being able to do what you do, get out and just socialize and have fun and do your job, is obviously, from a mental health perspective particularly, it is really challenging. So yeah, it's, you know, I guess lockdown hit, everyone kind of panicked. No one knew what the hell was going on. Everyone kind of thought, oh, I better get some stuff on social media and find my voice and do this, that, and the other. And then there was a brief reopening in the summer, which, you know, went quite well, but then everything closed again, and then opened again, and then closed again. And, you know, now we're looking to open again. But
do you think, on balance, that yo-yo has been part of the problem, or was it
yeah?
Because that Eat Out to Help Out and all the spike that we had in hospitality traffic that occurred over the summer, on balance, good or bad thing? Now what we know through the retrospective scope.
I think hospitality is hugely on the fence about that, to be honest. It depends who you speak to. In the short term, yeah. I'm sitting on the fence, yeah, which I don't normally do, to be fair. In the short term, of course, it was great, because when things first reopened in July of last year, I think initially there was a hesitation of people to go out. No one really knew how it was going to work. People getting used to checking in on the app and the masks, and it was the great unknown, which meant it was a slow start. And then obviously Eat Out to Help Out came in August, and then also September were really, for us, you know, the figures did jump back up again. But of course, you know, some people believe it was short-sighted because potentially it didn't help. You know, the data is clearly very unclear as to whether there was a direct correlation between actual, you know, people going out for a meal was the reason that the second wave came in. But I suppose a lot of hospitality leaders would say that if it was a factor, then obviously in the long run it didn't benefit, because now we've been closed again for another 5 months. So what was the point, sort of thing? But yeah, of course it encouraged people to get back out there. And, you know, if people are hesitant to go down to the pub because they weren't sure what was going on, if you suddenly put in a 2 for 1 and everyone suddenly is like, oh, well, okay, in that case then I better get back out there, which, you know, of course helped. And to be honest, if you look even in the bigger picture now, I've been out the last 3 days into London, you know, it is busy because we've been here before. Do you know what I mean? Like, people now are like, okay, I know the drill, meet my friends, sanitize, we check in, you know, social distance, wear your mask when you go into the toilet. And everyone is kind of comfortable and understands they can still have a good time and sort of gets how it works. So I suppose Eat Out to Help Out was like a trial period, if you like, to get people back out there, and that would have helped them kind of understand what the new hospitality world might look like at the moment, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. In the early stages of the pandemic, and obviously we're good mates, and you might have seen I was fairly early sounding the alarm from a health point of view because of some of the insights I was able to garner on the health policy side. The small p politics of that meant I was quite close to the fact that there was a lack of trade-off going on. You know, people weren't really having a mature conversation about the balance of health versus economics, or even social policy really wasn't being considered. It was all hype, and they were sort of frantic amongst the civil servants in the Department of Health and Public Health England. Mm-hmm. But once that lulled, and I made my peace with the fact that I wasn't going to be able to exert appropriate influence beyond my industry, really. I then sort of made my peace with that, got on with other things. But when things started to open up, and then I witnessed just how that clumsiness of policy wasn't just because of the novelty of the virus, it was just going to persist, and has persisted since, right? It hasn't made any coherent sense. One of the things that really made me upset, and it really, I'm not using that word lightly, it did, when I realized that and it might have been you that gave me this insight, but at a moment's notice, people were thinking they were opening their bar, and then one day, and then the next day they couldn't, and all their food and drink went off, you know, within a week. And the lack of preparedness, and the lack of insight, and the lack of respect, it seemed, for these, what I consider crucial industries for the social fabric, you know, in a romantic sense.
Mm-hmm.
I just found that to be fascinating and a perfect example of just how cavalier some of this has been. Is that your experience too?
100%. It's. I think there's a big trend at the moment in hospitality now for us to kind of push to have more of a voice. You know, there's talk of a hospitality minister, that kind of thing. Whether that would even be helpful, I'm not sure, but it'd be a start. But yeah, people, or it seems, it feels like, you know, not so much now, but certainly in the kind of the middle bit, if you like, between the two lockdowns, that, you know, you could have asked anyone who's ever pulled a pint in a pub, even if they did that when they were, you know, 18 or whatever, for a week, you know, things like the curfew, for example, does that make sense? And people would say no, right? Sure. Or, you know, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that, you know, bars and restaurants, if they think they're going to be open on, you know, Boxing Day, New Year's Eve, whatever, would have bought that stock in the week before. So if you then suddenly close it off, they've already spent that money, right? And then, so you know, I think there could have been more of a dialogue with hospitality itself to work out what makes sense and therefore what can be successful. You know, it really was just such a, like you say, clumsy is a good word. Like, and it kept changing, and also it changed in different areas of the country. So, like for me, I managed a team of 9 people across different regions in the UK, and it was almost a nightmare trying to keep up with which rules were in place for which. You know, obviously the tiering systems kept changing, that kind of thing. So it's just a constant nightmare of frustration. And I think the real, one of the most challenging things to witness was how draining it was for the venues themselves. I remember having a meeting in Manchester, actually. I think it was just before the November lockdown came in, perhaps, or maybe in December. I can't remember exactly. But I remember having a meeting, and the guys that I were meeting, which is one of the best venues in Manchester, I won't say who it is, but they were so almost dejected because hospitality is such a resilient industry. You know, it's ingrained into you when you're working 75 hours a week till 3 a.m, you know, on your feet, and people are very resilient. But every time, you know, I guess venues came up with a clever idea, so like, well, why don't we try this? Because this will work and this will help drive sales and make people feel safe, and we'll invest in X, Y, and Z to, you know, make sure we are being as sort of COVID conscious as we can. Mm-hmm. Then suddenly the rules would change again the next week. So I remember having this meeting, and they were just like, Chris, we're just done. Like, we just can't, everything we try and do, you know, then all of a sudden you've got to have a meal, or you've got to, you know, close at 10 o'clock, and it was just a never ending slog of, you know, fight back, be creative, you know, turn things around, and then all of a sudden that the rug is pulled from under you again, and it was just tiring, I think. Well,
one of the most important features of entrepreneurship or creativity in industry marketing, almost, is in any sector really, is the fact that you get to then test it and learn from that feedback loop. And what kept happening in this instance was that those creative endeavors were never given the time or chance to be properly tested, or that the goalposts would move, you know, mid-poster creation. You know, it was just crazy making. What's one of the things I want to ask the live audience? I know most of you tune in after the fact on your commutes, etc., and after the fact on the podcast as well on Spotify. But for those that are tuning in live, I just wonder, one of the questions I'm going to put to Chris a bit later is with regards to sort of COVID safety and trying to make sure we can understand how the hospitality industry is going to just try and instill that confidence, and then obviously phase those things out over time. But when I come to those things, which will be in a few minutes, I want to try and bring any of your questions you might have. How are you feeling about it? Just out of interest, you don't need to speak now as a therapist if you're watching, or in medicine, in healthcare. It's more just as a person. Have you gone out and got that first pint in a beer garden yet? Are you feeling any resistance? I know some people that have been very close to the pandemic, literally on the front line, mean that they're sorts of people that are wanting to, almost feeling a bit of a nervous caution. So I'm interested in what your thoughts are, guys. So please do share in the chat if you can, wherever you might be listening to this, and we'll bring that up and put it to Chris. So, but before I go there then, Chris, could you just go through the easing milestones as we know them then? Because it was this Monday was outdoor only. When we get to the next one, from what I understand, that's not guaranteed, but it's been laid out in the roadmap. So just spell it out for
us. So Monday this week was the reopening of outdoor areas. Like I say, that that doesn't mean that hospitality suddenly is straight back up to 100% and everything's rosy, because of course, if you don't have an outdoor area, for example, you can't sell anything. I think it's the 17th of May is then the next stage, which will allow indoor areas. I don't want to get this wrong now. I think indoor areas with a rule of 6 from any household. And then the 21st of June apparently is when everything goes back to normal. Whether that will be the case, obviously we don't know. We hope it will be. But that's, you've got to think in terms of milestones. Try and think in your head in terms of different styles of venue. So if, for example, you're a nightclub or a gig venue or a stadium, which, we all can, we consider that part of hospitality. Yeah. Obviously, those people literally haven't opened their doors at any point, really. Or, a festival, for example, it's, and they're the businesses, it's great, of course, that, pubs, for example, with the big gardens are probably doing quite well this week and having a great time. That's fantastic. But let's not forget the people who literally haven't opened at any point all the way through this process. It's just very, very difficult. So yeah, I mean, they're the milestones, and fingers crossed, of course, they are what they are, and everything goes to plan.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously don't know if those goalposts will get moved again, but one of the things that seems increasingly likely is that day of it meant to be relaxed restrictions completely is something that is likely to have a caveat that I think will be applied to hospitality, at least to some degree, which will be some sort of being called a passporting system. Yeah. What's your take first on the feasibility of that, do you feel, in hospitality, and the likelihood of that being picked up?
Great question. Something we've been musing around for the last few weeks quite a lot. I mean, for us, ultimately, it wouldn't be us that would be making that call. It'd be the venues themselves. Is it feasible? Yes. We live in an age where, people are checking in now to venues on apps on their phone to say they've been there. So I suppose if there is a passport on a phone that people can just show, then, that could be your key to get into a venue, of course. I suppose that, the bigger question, it's a philosophical, what's right in terms of, expecting people to have a vaccine. Is that really taking away their freedom? Is going to a pub seen as, a right of freedom, or is it more important for the venue, I guess, to have the right to not allow people in who might infect other people, which I guess is more of a greater good kind of viewpoint on it. Yeah, it's a really difficult one. I'm going to sit on the fence again, of course.
What do you mean, of course? Yeah. I don't think I've ever known you have so many splinters in your ass in this conversation.
It's definitely feasible, I think. Obviously, the bit that would be hard, I think, for hospitality will potentially be the pushback they would get from guests and customers coming in. Like, thinking back to when I was running a bar, I'd hate to be in a situation where, you kind of have to say that, I'm sorry, you don't have a vaccine, or you don't have a test, or whatever the rules are going to be, and therefore you can't come in. And then, potentially that could cause friction. And, is it really the job of the venue to then police that? Do you know what I mean? Like, but
this is the bit that I'm meaning. When I ask after feasibility, I don't mean bureaucratic infrastructure beyond it to mandate it, or for it to make sense as to technically how you do it. But most venues aren't 2 bouncers at the door venues in which it's check your ticket, or so this is something that might occur, I imagine, at the bar, right? So someone's at the bar, yeah, and they've got to check something, an ID card or equivalent, when ordering 6 pints, and then the 6th person, yep, and it's like, well, no, I don't have one for whatever reason, or I've forgotten it, or whatever, right? That for me seems a bit mad. Like, what's that solo bar staff doing then? Is it inferred that person has to evict them as if, because you've got right to refuse service for any reason in a private business, of course you have, but it's so rare that you need to then mandate it, right? Or you're able to call for some security backup, police, etc. Is it inferred then that said so bar staff would then what call the police on that person, or if they wouldn't leave, and especially because there's some strong opinions in this direction. I mean, we've spoken about it on this show a number of times, and my opinion's strong on it. But similarly, is it strong enough for me to be the person that's then going dead weight on a random barmaid trying to evict me from a bar for the sake of me? Not, I doubt it, right? So I'm not meaning that, but there are opinions that are so strong that people would make a stand. And that's the thing that concerns me for your industry. It's like that's not a pressure that should be felt by bar staff after all they've been through.
I mean, I guess it already happened to an extent with the kind of single household rule and that kind of thing. There was a big conversation around is it the job of the venue to police that, and how would they even go about it? So if they, if a group of 6 are coming in and they're like, yeah, we all live in the same house, what is someone getting paid, £8 an hour, or whatever, meant to kind of search back into the address history of every single person that comes in and prove it? Like, it's really difficult to do. And obviously, the vaccine thing would be the next level up from that. You've got to look at, say, for example, they needed to put door staff on to check before people even came into the venue. Then that's an extra cost in terms of wages. So it's, when I say it's feasible, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be, it wouldn't be really, really hard to implement. But I assume, right now, of course, venues just, they want to be busy and make as much money as they can, but we need to find a sustainable future whereby, we don't keep having to lock down. And if that means trying to find a way to make sure everyone is as safe as possible by people not literally being able to get in to kind of infect people, then I'm sure that most venues would want to take that option, because they obviously want their guests to be safe and they don't want to have to close again. So
sure, no, I get it. It's a funny balance and a lot of pressure on a lot of people's shoulders that certainly don't deserve it, in my opinion. Got a couple of text messages come through to me saying that the Facebook commenting isn't working for some reason on the stream, so apologies for that. I've just twiddled a few dials behind the scenes to see if that might work, and so hopefully it'll start working now. But that does mean that I've been text questions and comments. So Sam has said, for example, that happy with the process as it stands for safety, and are keen to be out and keen to do as much as they can within safe procedures at the moment, and really excited to be back going. We've had a comment here from Katie, a bit of a long one, so I don't think I'll get through all of it, but she's mentioning no country's got this entirely right, and I suppose I want to come to that bit first. There's more there from Katie, but Chris, are you aware of other countries in hospitality that have got it right or got it better?
I think, I think to go back to talking about the frustrations that we had through that period, that's not to say that I think anyone was expecting that it should have just been like, it was the great unknown. Okay, so no one knew, from the government to the industry to policymakers to whatever. It was all trial and error, and that's obviously why there was so much frustration, because you don't get it right every time, and it had to keep changing. In terms of I don't have, I guess, the figures or the facts. I think there is a perception that places like Singapore, for example, apparently have done very well. They were doing sort of temperature checks on arrival from day one, that kind of thing. Obviously having like a working app and that kind of thing probably would help as well. But it sounds like, we don't sell globally, but we do work with brands who are global. And to be honest, it sounds like pretty much every country has obviously had a tough time of it in hospitality. So
right, yeah, we're going to say there aren't any obvious leading lights necessarily that we could model from, and obviously that's always nested within the context of what that country's doing at that given time, independent of the sector, really.
And it's, as you alluded to before, it's about the style of venue. So if you're, I don't know, a high-class restaurant in the middle of a city centre and it's booking only, and it's all table service and all that kind of stuff, that's a lot easier to manage than, as you say, like a big beer garden in the middle of nowhere where just that style of service isn't the norm and people aren't used to it.
Yeah, I mean, the beer garden thing I think is fascinating, because some of the best beer gardens, you're literally like walking down the street and then you notice that your mates are there and then you go and catch a beer with them. There's no way that like you're on literally like the edge of that boundary of that venue. You're just parking. You're walking. You sat down. Yeah, sod it, I will have one. It's just I can't. That's the feasibility thing that I'm just fascinated by, and also it suits the fact that my position is also that these things aren't a smart move. I think therein lies the danger, to be honest.
think at the moment the way that it now is so much more simple that I think that will help. You know, it was the whole substantial meal thing, for example. That was so difficult because exactly. Well, you're forcing people to overeat. The waste of food, like people go and buy a drink and then the food gets thrown in the bin. Like, you know, where's the ethical side of that? There was just so many facets to it that were just so difficult to manage and just didn't make any sense. Yeah. Whereas now it is literally like, okay, you can be open, but you have to have an outdoor area. And then in May, that will change into indoors. You need to be in 6. Done. That's obviously, you know, and social distancing and sanitizing and everything else. But just generally, it's much more simple now, and hopefully that will therefore be successful for people.
Yeah, and Katie alluded to it in the message she posted onto LinkedIn, but also a message I've had here from Emma, who on text, who's telling me about this Facebook issue that apparently is persisting, saying that it's that the young people, especially those that are, say, coming of age, those that are only now legal to get into venues and to drink legally and stuff, just like that is something that's fascinating. In your typical festival goers, Katie's mentioning there that she's teenager booked for Reading Festival, and that'll make his year this year, no doubt. What's your take on the sort of generational divides on this stuff? Do you think that makes a big difference to this conversation?
Yeah, well, to personalize it a bit, my niece, who I think you might have met at some point, is now nearly 17, right? So obviously this is, let's put aside the conversation, obviously, of drinking in venues illegally and that kind of thing, but more of a generational and people's youth conversation. You know, if you think back to the fun that you had between the ages of, 15 and a half through to 17, 18 years old, like they're such important days of your life, obviously. You know, if that is just kind of completely taken away from you and everything's closed, you can't do anything, there's no festivals, there's no events, there's, like, you never get that time back. Or university, for example, like I can't imagine what it must have been like to be a fresher over the last year. You know, you are unable to have the same experience from a sort of social side of things, which is super important. And you can never do it again because you can't get that time back again. So, talking about trade-offs, obviously that's such a big factor, I think, to kind of consider.
Yeah, exactly. I just think that there's quite understandably going to be a resentful generation for the policy that's occurred, as well as just the shaking the fist at the bad luck of it. I'm not even inferring fault there. I'm just meaning like generally like cosmic injustice more than anything. It's just fascinating. And yeah, you're right. I suppose I was making the mistake then of thinking like, imagine you've just come of age and you can start drinking legally and going out with your mates and stuff. It's like, well, actually, that's not the fact that there might be a sort of a system and a state intervention for who can drink in there, regardless of age. Then you're definitely not going to. The hoops you'd have to jump through, a piecemeal fake ID from yesteryear is certainly not going to cut it when they're literally doing a retina scan or whatever it might be that comes in from the biosecurity side of this that might emerge. It seems it's a good point I hadn't really considered. So yeah.
I think I suppose obviously the flip side, of course, is that that's just life, right? This has happened, and I'm sure people who were teenagers and coming of age in the war, for example, you just got to get on with it and adapt to the situation that we have in front of you. But yeah, of course, it's a huge shame, and for the generation that have lived through this, in all, it could be any age group will have been affected in one way or another.
In different ways, yeah, no, for sure. So I said I'd get round to asking it. What are the sort of typical ways in which hospitality are going to be helping to comply with both legislation and good ethics and practices to try and keep people safe, but also instill that confidence within the market again?
Well, it's so important to us in hospitality, and I think that's the bit that sometimes people miss. So I saw a Twitter video that went viral this week of Old Compton Street in Soho, where I was this week. And the way the video makes it look, is that it's absolute pandemonium. And, there was so many comments of like, oh, we'll be back in lockdown in 3 weeks. This is ridiculous, yada, yada, yada. And it's like, first of all, I think the video really, to me, if venues are open and people are in them, then no one's doing anything wrong, right? Because that's the decision has been made to open them. It's not like people were, chanting and jumping on each other. It was just a video of a lot of people sat in a busy street because the venues are open again. so if we make the decision to go ahead with opening, then you can't then condemn people for doing it. I don't think, because then if that's the case, then should they be open? So if we accept that they should be open, then let people go out, I think is kind of point number one. But I'm rambling now. So it's the venues and hospitality, of course, are unbelievably keen to make sure that it is as safe as it possibly can be. One, obviously, to keep people safe. Two, to make sure because of that we don't all have to close again. And three, just to make sure that there is no room for criticism. So people are trying to be as safe as they possibly can. So I guess it starts with kind of checking in, track and trace, sanitizing tables, sanitizing hands, wearing masks in between. If you're getting up to go to the toilet, you need to put your mask on. Obviously the rules around kind of groups of 6 and households and that kind of thing are all in place. But yeah, people are just doing everything they possibly can to make sure that everything is as clean as it possibly can be. And still to this day, we don't really have the data to show, how many infections were caused in hospitality venues. And I know that the people we speak to every day, as our customers, they are adamant that going into a restaurant is just as safe, if not safer, than a million and one other things that you could choose to do. But yet hospitality does seem to get, it feels like, without sounding like too much of a victim, that there's a lot of blame placed on hospitality. And my argument would be, if people want to behave like idiots, that's not necessarily the industry's fault. It's society's problem, right?
Yeah, I think that's, for me, I agree with all that. And it's also something that I've been reflecting on a lot, in that it is a scapegoat industry, but also something that a certain group of people, certain class of people will just infer that is just it's a frivolous and hedonistic pursuit, right? And that's what different types of revelers and louts would do, whereas our classy dinner party is just a different phenomenon, rather than the fact that those are different ways of skinning that cat and to socialize with your friends. And that, I think there is a class dynamic that's definitely for another show, mate, which I'm sure we can go off on one. But I also see it as being a proxy for another conversation me and you could have, and both we're passionate about, which is that sometimes football is a scapegoat. It's like this notion of football hooliganism, as if that's the norm, rather than it being something that is a story from its past, in which there's still, of course, fringe issues. But fundamentally, when you think of the numbers, it's not fair to cast aspersions on a whole for the issues of a minority. And I think that is just, it's the low-hanging fruit in a cultural conversation, whereby it's like, oh, look at that, that's so frivolous compared to health interventions and fitness interventions. And I think that socializing hospitality aspect is something that is therefore downplayed. If you downplay its benefit and then you upplay the risk, no wonder people get hyped about it. And I'm irritated by that. Obviously, we're doing what we can to make our small bit of noise to try and puncture it. But thanks for all you're doing. I'll let you get back to the important work of which you do, getting booze into people's hands. And thanks a lot for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Nice one. See you soon, mate. All the best.
Cheers. Bye.